Good morning. My name is Glenn Lewis. I'm the care pastor here at the church. And this morning, we are going to be talking about a sermon called No Excuses. Okay? In your notes, I want you to turn to the middle in number 16, and I just want you to cross something out for me if you use your notes. Number 16 says, whatever you do, do it with all your blank, as if you are doing it for blank. I want you to cross out if you are. That shouldn't be there. So it should be, whatever you do, do it with all your blank as doing it for blank. And a lot of you already know what's going to be in the blanks, but anyway. I doubt that there's any of us who have not at some time in our lives come up with some lame excuse as to why we didn't do what we were supposed to do. Now here's a few excuses that supposedly actually were used. Got on the internet, it's got to be true, right? Please excuse Jennifer for missing school yesterday. We forgot to get the Sunday paper off the porch, and when we found it on Monday, we thought it was Sunday. I'm sorry I didn't make it to work yesterday. I accidentally got on an airplane. I'm sorry I missed work yesterday. I forgot I had been hired. Then there are the types of excuses we use not because we didn't do something, but because we don't want to do something. I can't come to work today. My uniform caught on fire while I was drying it in the microwave. I'm sorry, I won't be in work today. My car is blocked in by the police raiding my home. I won't make it to work today. I was at a party last night and I lost my car. Ben Franklin said, he who is good at making excuses is seldom good at anything else. George Washington Carver said, 99% of the failures come from people who have the habit of making excuses. Today we continue our series on Joseph, and as you remember from Pastor Steve's sermon last week, Joseph's father, Jacob, favored Joseph more than all his brothers. They hated him for this, and then when Jacob gave Joseph this special coat, they hated him even more. Then you add to that the dreams that Joseph was having of him ruling over his family, and you can see that some serious sibling rivalry was about to explode. So one day, when his brothers were out with the sheep, Jacob sends Joseph out to meet them. When his brothers see him coming, they decide this is a good time to put an end to Joseph and his sweet coat and his foolish dreams. They plan to kill him and then make it look as though he was killed by wild animals. But before that happens, they change their minds. After all, he is our own flesh and blood, they say. So when they see a caravan of Ishmaelites passing by, they decide, why not make a little money on the side? They sell him to the caravan, which is on its way to Egypt. So we're going to pick up the story there, and then we're going to see why, if anyone ever had a reason for making excuses, it was Joseph. But as we will also see, apparently he didn't. There was something about Joseph that set him apart from most people. There was something people could see in Joseph that was different. But that didn't mean Joseph's life was all chocolates and roses. All of us live lives with peaks and valleys. We have highs and lows, light and dark, good and bad. It's just the way life is. But for Joseph, it wasn't the typical up and down life. When Joseph was up, he was really up. He was a favorite son of a wealthy landowner. One day he would become the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. But when he was down, he was really down. He was sold to slave traders by his own brothers. He was put in prison for something he didn't do. But as we read about what Joseph did while he was in these very low, dark circumstances, we will discover something very uncommon about Joseph. We're going to begin our study in Genesis chapter 39. Have your Bibles, you can turn there, or you can watch it up on the screen. Verse 1, 39:1, very first part of the verse. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. This was obviously a low for Joseph. He's been taken down to Egypt as a slave. He's in a foreign country. As far as he knows, he has no hope of ever going home. He doesn't know to whom he will be sold. Joseph would have to learn a new language. He would have to learn a new culture. At 17, he would be totally separated from his faith. He couldn't go down to the local papyrus store and buy a Bible. It hadn't been written yet. The law had not been given yet. There was no Jewish religion yet. There was no Jewish nation yet. He would have no one to encourage him in his faith and his relationship with the one true God. Everything Joseph had built his life on had been ripped out from underneath him. He was totally alone. He'd been abandoned by his brothers. His family was gone, and he was a slave in a country he knew very little about. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us what Joseph was feeling. We're not told anything about what he was thinking at the moment he arrived in Egypt. But there are a few things we do know as we look at what Joseph did that will help us understand some of the things that were most likely going on in Joseph's heart and mind. Let's keep reading in verse 1. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Now, this is significant. I suppose just about anyone could have bought Joseph. In ancient Egypt, there were no slave auctions, but there was a system as to how slaves were bought and sold. So Joseph became a part of that system. And as far as we know, anyone could have bought Joseph. But what's key here is not just anyone did buy Joseph. The captain of Pharaoh's guard bought him. And look at the next line, the first part of verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. It wasn't by accident that the captain of the guard bought Joseph. It wasn't by the will of Joseph's brothers or the will of the Ishmaelites or even Potiphar himself. It was God who put Joseph where he was. And what we're going to see as we continue is that Joseph bought into God's will. Even though he didn't know why he was a slave or what was going to happen next, Joseph still believed in God. Even though we don't really know how Joseph felt or what he was thinking, we do know that God didn't leave Joseph. Now, here's something important to remember, that even though God didn't leave Joseph, he was still a slave. This is extremely important because at this moment, even though Joseph knew God was with him, at this moment, Joseph had no idea what was ahead of him. God was allowing him to be where he was. Even though he was with Joseph, he did not change Joseph's circumstances. We know the rest of the story, but at this moment, Joseph didn't. As far as he knew, he would be a slave for the rest of his life. Now imagine how you would feel in that situation. Let's keep reading and see what happens. Verses 2 to 6. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, in these verses, again, we don't get much direct insight into what Joseph was feeling as a slave, but we do get a lot of insight into what Joseph was doing, and this will give us some insights into what was going on in Joseph's head. The verses tell us some important things about Joseph's situation. Potiphar saw that the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord made him successful in everything he did. He became overseer of the whole house and everything in it. He was trusted implicitly by his master. Potiphar didn't have to worry about anything while Joseph was in charge. Now, what does this tell us about what Joseph was thinking? Why did Potiphar make Joseph the head of his household? The obvious reason was the Lord was with Joseph. And because of that, the Lord blessed Potiphar and everything he owned. Potiphar knew that his blessing was coming from Joseph's God. But how did Potiphar know this? How did he see the Lord in Joseph? He could have thought it was one of his own Egyptian gods and was blessing him for that. He could have thought it was just his hard work that was finally paying off. What was it that made it so obvious that it was Joseph and not anything else that was the reason for all his blessing? What did Joseph do? How did he act that would make Potiphar specifically see him or see the Lord in him. But before we get to that, I want us to remember how Joseph got into Potiphar's house. He was sold by his brothers to some traders who sold him to Potiphar. He had been his father's favorite, and now he's a slave. Just a few short weeks before, he was living a great life with everything he could ever want. Now he has nothing. His dignity is gone. His wealth is gone. His pride is gone. He's a slave, the lowest man on the social totem pole. Therefore, when Joseph first got to Potiphar's house, there's no reason to expect that Joseph would be in a good place, mentally or emotionally. There's no reason to expect that Joseph would have any reason to be a good slave. So far, his only crime has been perhaps a little teenage arrogance and cockiness, but all the other things that happened to him were not his fault. It wasn't his fault that all his brothers were older than him. It wasn't his fault that his mom, his dad's favorite wife, couldn't have kids for most of her life, but now that she's had Joseph, he automatically becomes dad's favorite. It wasn't his fault that in his family you had not only the typical sibling rivalries of any family, you had 4 moms living in the same house. Talk about a blended family. It wasn't Joseph's fault that he had those dreams. It wasn't his fault that his brothers were just plain jealous. There is nothing in Joseph's life that would make you think that he would end up in Egypt as a slave. Hated by his brothers? Yeah. But a slave? No. But here he is. And because of that, Joseph should have been angry, frustrated, bitter, and full of self-pity. He should have had no reason to do anything other than exactly what his master told him to do. And the only reason to do even the bare minimum was because of the fear of the consequences if he didn't. And the reason we really need to grasp this fact is because only then can we truly appreciate what happens next. Joseph goes from being just a typical slave to becoming the head of Potiphar's household. Joseph had every right to be down, discouraged, and hopeless. Instead, he seems to ignore all that and work his way into becoming the most important guy in Potiphar's home. So let's get back to that question of what did Joseph do to make the Lord so obvious in his life? Well, the first and most important thing we need to understand is that the Lord was in his life. That's the prime reason for his success. God was with Joseph, and obviously Joseph was with God. God was preparing the way for Joseph. He was setting things in motion that were supernatural to help Joseph succeed. The text tells us that everything he did was successful. Even as a regular slave, Potiphar noticed that Joseph always made the right decisions, and those decisions he made always made things better for Potiphar. God was up to something, and Joseph, being a slave, was a part of that something that God was up to. But most importantly, Joseph bought into it. In spite of everything bad that had happened to Joseph, he still trusted God and bought into God's plan. Steve made this very clear last week. God had a plan for Joseph, and Joseph was becoming the man God wanted him to be. Of course, at this time, Joseph had no idea what that plan was. Those dreams of him being leader of the family, they were just dreams. Slaves don't lead families. But in spite of that, Joseph still allowed God to work in his life, even though it didn't appear God was doing anything good for Joseph. Even with God's presence in Joseph's life, he was still a slave. What I really want us to understand here is that God wasn't just making all Joseph's decisions work out well. God wasn't just manipulating the circumstances around Joseph to make him successful. There was something else going on besides just blessing Joseph and blessing Potiphar's house. He was also doing something in Joseph's life. When we say the Lord was with Joseph, it means that he was doing things both inside and outside. God was doing things for Joseph, but he was also doing things in Joseph that made his presence in Joseph obvious. Because the Lord was with Joseph, there was something different about him. There was something that set Joseph apart, not only from other slaves, but from other people. Joseph was unique. He was different. What was the difference? What was it that Potiphar saw in Joseph that told him the Lord was with him? Maybe he had some kind of aura or glow about him, like a halo or something like that. Or maybe he floated around the room. I don't know, something like that. Maybe he spoke wise proverbs and deep theological thoughts. Well, I suppose that's possible. But from the text, I don't think that's why Potiphar knew the Lord was with him. If Joseph had some unusual spiritual gifts, or if he had some sort of spiritual aura around him, then Potiphar may have sold him to the temple or made him a priest in his own home. But that's not what he did. When we look at the way Potiphar treated Joseph, it is apparent that there was something else that most impressed Potiphar. It wasn't some huge supernatural aura surrounding Joseph that gave Potiphar the idea that God was with him. It was something else that got his attention. It wasn't just what God was doing around Joseph. It wasn't just that God was causing everything Joseph did to work right. Because God was with Joseph, not only did the things outside Joseph go well, God was also doing things inside Joseph as well. When the writer of Genesis says that God was with Joseph, he means that Joseph was in process. Just like these pots that Steve talked about last week were at one time in process. It takes time to make a beautiful piece of pottery. It takes time to go from a lump of clay to a useful vessel. It takes time to build a leader, and God was working on Joseph in order to prepare him for the leadership he would one day have. Not only was God causing him to be successful, he was also working on Joseph himself. Because God was working on Joseph as a person, Joseph's behavior made it obvious that God was with him. So what was it about his behavior that caused Potiphar to make him head of the household? By the way, did I mention that Joseph was still a slave? There's no reason for him to be a slave. It wasn't his fault that he became a slave. It would have been easy for him to do only what his master told him to do. In fact, that was all that was expected from a slave. I wouldn't be surprised if his fellow slaves didn't tell him, "Don't make waves, just do what you're told and you'll be fine." But Joseph didn't act like a slave. He didn't do what the typical slave would do. He didn't do just what was expected of him. From the way Potiphar treated Joseph, it seems that he did more than was expected. And that's why Potiphar kept moving him up. The reason he didn't act like a slave goes back to that one fact. The Lord was with Joseph. The power of God was not only around Joseph, it was in Joseph. Well, how did that power show itself? Well, the Bible actually tells us what a slave is supposed to act like. In fact, the verses we're about to dive into will give us principles that are timeless. They're just as relevant today as they were in Joseph's time and as they were in Paul's time. So I want us to turn to Paul's letter to the Colossians, chapter 3, and we're going to read verses 18 to 24. Wives, submit yourself to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Now, I realize these first 4 verses don't speak specifically to slavery, but they do give us some context as to the importance of Paul's admonition to the slaves. Paul believed that the family was the strength of any culture. Family relationships were and are critical to the success of a culture. Paul often had family front and center in his teaching. But there is a principle that is equally important, and Paul is going to use slavery as a way to describe it. Paul could have left out verse 22 completely. Slaves, obey your earthly masters. He could have left that out completely, and the reason is because the admonition in verse 23 and 24 fits everyone. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. This is not something just for slaves. Yeah, he's using slaves as an example, but this applies to everyone. No matter what your social status is, no matter what your job is, no matter what we are doing, work at it with all our heart. But he keeps that verse in. Why? Well, before we get to that, let's look at verse 23. Whatever you do, do it with all your heart as working for the Lord. Really? Whatever I do, I'm supposed to work at it with all my heart? You mean that no matter what job I'm doing, I should be working at it with all my heart? That's what it says, exactly what it says. But Glenn, you don't understand. I didn't choose my job. I don't even like my job. This is not the job I really wanted. I just need to make ends meet until I get something I really want to do. When I get that job, then I can really put my heart into it. But Glenn, you don't know my job. All I do is put a piece of hose on a car as it passes over my head, and that's it. That's all I do. Most boring job in the world. It's a struggle even to wake up in the morning. Whatever you do, do it with all your heart as working for the Lord. You don't know my boss. He's not a good boss. He changes the rules all the time. One day he's in a great mood and everything's wonderful. The next day he's in a terrible mood and everything's miserable. You can't imagine what it's like working for him. There's no way I can give him 100%. Glenn, you don't know what the environment is like where I work. It is toxic. There is constant gossip and backbiting. There are cliques and all kinds of politics. I hate going to work in the morning. Whatever you do, do it with all your heart as working for the Lord. Glenn, where I work, nobody even cares if I do a good job or not. The boss is lazy, my coworkers are lazy, I'm even lazy. Nobody from the main office has been in to check on us for years. If I start doing things right and well, it's going to cause all kinds of problems. Glenn, you don't get it. My bosses are idiots. Because of the way they do things, we waste so much time. I talked to the boss, and all he said was, sorry, we're doing it this way, and that's it. How can I keep working hard when I know I'm wasting so much time? Whatever you do, do it with all your heart as working for the Lord. Students, and it doesn't matter if you're in college, high school, middle school, or even elementary school, I know you have some fantastic courses and classes that you love, and you have some great instructors and professors and teachers, and it's easy to study for them, and it's easy to get good grades for them. But some of your teachers don't even seem to care about you. How can you work hard for them? Or you have this ridiculous required class that is just plain boring, and you really don't want to take it, but you have to take it, so you have to sit through it. I just can't get into it. Whatever you do, do it with all your heart as working for the Lord. Yeah, but if I had a job that made a difference, then I would. Yeah, but if I had a job that paid a decent wage, then I would. Yeah, but if I had a good boss, then I would. Yeah, but if I had good coworkers who worked hard, then I would. And this is why Paul puts in verse 22. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever your job is, it is not worse than being a slave. As a slave, you have no rights, you have no security, you have no status, you have no freedom, you have no money. Paul wants us to know that even if you are a slave, and I know some of you may feel like you're slaves where you work, but even if you are a slave with the worst master in the world, the worst task in the world, the worst environment in the world, you are still to do your work with all your heart as working for the Lord. A quick note here. You may find yourself in a job where it is impossible to do it as working for the Lord. There may be moral or ethical expectations you can't meet as a believer. In that case, you may have to look for another job. But for most of us, God is not concerned about what job you used to have that you really liked, or what job you want to have that would be so much better. God is concerned about what you are doing right now. It doesn't matter what the job is, who your coworkers are, or who your boss is. God has put you in this place at this time and given you this job, and He expects you to do it with all your heart. You don't know what role this job may play in your life or the life of someone who's watching you. It wasn't just that the Lord was with Joseph. It was that the Lord was with him, and Joseph embraced the Lord's plan for his life. Pastor Steve emphasized this last week. God had a plan for Joseph, and Joseph trusted God even when he didn't know what the plan was, and he didn't know what was going to happen next. When he entered Potiphar's house, he didn't know he would one day be over the whole household. He didn't know that one day he'd be accused of attempted rape and end up in prison. He didn't know that one day he'd become second most powerful man in all of Egypt. He didn't know that his position would one day lead to the salvation of his family and ultimately lead to the salvation of an entire nation. But whether a slave, a prisoner, or a king, Joseph knew this one principle: whatever you do, do it with all your heart, as working for the Lord. Joseph understood it didn't matter what he was doing before. It didn't matter what he would do in the future. What mattered was what he was doing right now. At some point, either while he was on his way to Egypt or after he became Potiphar's slave in Egypt, Joseph decided that even though he was a slave, the worst job in the world, the most demeaning job in the world, the worst paying job in the world, he was going to allow God to mold him and shape him into the man he would become. At some point, Joseph decided that whatever he was doing, with whomever he was doing it, wherever he was doing it, he did it as though he was doing it for the Lord. If you want people to know that the Lord is with you, this is where it starts. You embrace the place God's put you, and you trust him to work through you in this place today. You embrace the place God has put you, and you work at it with all your heart. I want to add one more thing here. This is sort of an aside, but it is another example of why Potiphar put so much trust in Joseph, even though it ended up bad for both of them. A person of integrity will do the right thing. He or she will do the right thing because their character and their integrity motivate them to do the right thing. But there's also the flip side to it. A person of integrity will also not do the wrong thing. There are people who are great at their jobs. They always meet or exceed their goals. Their work is always in the A to A+ category, but morally, they're bankrupt. The hashtag #MeToo phenomenon has brought to our attention way too many people who are excellent at their jobs, but totally corrupt outside of them. Their motto is, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But Joseph shows us something different. For the sake of time, I'm just going to summarize the last half of this chapter. This chapter tells us that Joseph was a serious dude. It calls him well-built and handsome. He was, as some would say, easy on the eyes. Now, that's usually not a bad thing, but it was for Joseph. Joseph worked in Potiphar's house, and he had access to everything in the house except for Potiphar's wife. She was off limits. She was off limits for 3 reasons. She was married, she was married, she was married. But somehow, Potiphar's wife missed that part. She didn't care that she was married. She wanted Joseph. Then one day, the two of them were alone in the house. No one was with them. They could do whatever they wanted to do, and no one would know. She grabbed Joseph and tried to get him to go to bed with her. And if you read the story, you'll see this was not the first time this happened. She had been trying to get him day after day after day. Now was the time. No one would know. This was the perfect opportunity. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Again, we don't know what was going on in Joseph's mind. We don't know how strong that temptation was, but what we do know is what Joseph did. He ran out of the house. Joseph not only did the right things, he also didn't do the wrong things. His integrity is a part of his whole life, not just some of it. And what was the result of his moral stand? Potiphar's wife accuses him of trying to rape her, and he's thrown into prison. The Lord was with Joseph, and Joseph was with the Lord. Joseph's integrity, because of his relationship to the Lord, would not allow him to do the wrong thing, even if it meant suffering. And the amazing thing is that even though Joseph was falsely accused and now a prisoner, he still does what he always does. He does the right thing. And because of that, he ends up being in charge of the whole jail. I want to show you a quick video.
Integrity.
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 It is defined not in what you've done,
But in who you are.
It is revealed in doing the right thing.
Even when no one is watching. It's a sense of uncorrupted virtue.
the opposite of hypocrisy.
It is having values
and being consistent with those values,
while not wavering due to outside influences,
regardless of how dangerous or unpopular it might be.
It is the ultimate skill
in living the good life,
doing the right thing
in the right way,
at the right time,
for the right reasons.
It is a belief system
without falter,
complete,
unbroken.
It's a lifestyle committed to firmness
and strength.
It's principle-centered living, integrity.
Integrity.
Why have we forgotten you?
If anyone had a reason not to have integrity, it was Joseph. If anyone ever had a reason for making excuses, it was Joseph. If anyone ever had a reason to be frustrated and bitter and angry, it was Joseph. If anyone ever had a reason to think he didn't need to put his heart into his work, it was Joseph. If anyone ever had a reason to say, I deserve a little fun with a woman who wants me, it was Joseph. But Joseph chose integrity. He didn't make excuses. As far as we can tell, he wasn't frustrated, he wasn't bitter, he wasn't angry, and he wasn't feeling sorry for himself. Even when he was a slave, and even when he was a prisoner, God was with him and he was with God. And because of the power of God living in Joseph, he not only knew what he was supposed to do, he had the God-given power to do it with all his heart. It didn't matter where he was or what he was doing or who he was doing it for. When he was a 17-year-old slave, he did his work with all his heart. When he was moved up to the head of Potiphar's household, he did his work with all his heart. When he was in prison, whatever work he did it with all his heart. And that is how Potiphar saw the Lord was with Joseph. Yeah, Potiphar saw the blessings he was getting, but if 17-year-old Joseph had not been faithful at the menial tasks he was first given to do as a rookie slave, he never would have gotten Potiphar's attention, and he never would have completed the plan God had in store for him. And as we will see in the next 2 weeks, if Joseph hadn't been faithful as a slave and a prisoner, he never would have completed the plan God has for his family and ultimately for the nation of Israel. Whatever you do, no matter how boring, menial, unimportant, or difficult it may seem to you, do it with all your heart as working for the Lord. We don't know how the task we're doing today is fitting into God's plan for our lives and the lives of those we impact today and will impact in the future. So, what do we do with this? Well, I have some questions for you to ponder this week for yourself, and I'd also like you to use them in your life group when you get together. First question, what would it look like if whatever I did it with all my heart? Just think about your life. Just think about what you're going to be doing for the next week. Family, work, friends, church, whatever it is. What would it look like if whatever I did it with all my heart? Second question. Potiphar saw the Lord in Joseph. What do people see in me? Potiphar saw the Lord in Joseph. What do people see in me? The way I work, the way I act, my attitude, my mouth? What do people see in me? And lastly, what excuses am I making in my life that are keeping me from becoming the man or woman, boy or girl God has called me to be right now? Let's pray together. Father, I thank you that through your Spirit, just like you were with Joseph, you are with us. You live inside us. You've given us your Spirit. And I pray, Lord, that we will pay attention. I pray, Lord, that we will be aware that we belong to you. And that everything we do, we're doing it for you. I pray, Lord, that we will be the people, become the people that you want us to be, so that we can do the things you want us to do, and people will see you in us. And I pray it in Jesus' name.